having this conversation with you, it's almost poetic in a sense, because it feels like your journey to the work you do and even the book, How to Be an Antiracist, started with an experience your parents had in 1970. And you even start your book with it, where they went to a student conference in Illinois in 1970, Urbana in 1970, to hear a preacher, Tom Skinner, speak in this group Soul Liberation Play. I'm wondering if you could kind of tell that story a bit.
Yeah, so my parents, came of age in New York City in the late 1960s, and they both were inspired by what at the time was Black sort of liberation theology, which apparently was a radical idea to suggest that God was not white or Jesus was Black, and that the church should be an engine of liberation for Black people and humankind. And so as Christians, as young Christians, they were inspired by those types of, ideas. And there was a major sort of youth Christian conference that was organized in Urbana at the University of Illinois, and locally, my parents decided in New York City that they were going to be a part of this large group of Black students who came to this conference that had 10,000 students, and I think maybe about 500 of them were Black. And that these students, particularly their organizers and leaders, were able to convince the conference to get, for basically to have like a Black night, where Tom Skinner, who was a major Black evangelical liberation theologian who spoke, but then before he hopped on the stage, Soul Liberation, which was this sort of musical group, spoke, I should say, sung. And my parents, even to this day, when I mention the name Soul Liberation, their face sort of lights up. And it goes back to 1970. And even thereafter, Soul Liberation was a group that played around New York City and even around the country, sort of a Black power oriented form of, gospel.
For anyone who, I'm sure a lot of people over the last couple of years have rediscovered Aretha Franklin's Amazing Grace. And it's like, if you want to take it to the next logical step, you got to check Soul Liberation out.
Yeah, and even if you can find pictures, because they of course had the fros, they had the dashikis, they had it all going.
It was fantastic. And it's and you write in the book that, that's really changed your parents' perception. I believe they were Christian before, but changed their perception of how their religion and their Blackness sort of interacted, and changed sort of their view on also their beliefs and their ideologies and the history of their beliefs and everything, right? Pretty much revolutionized them.
It did. Very, very simply, they had been raised on this idea that Jesus and that the church was supposed to save people from their backward, uncivilized sort of ways. And Tom Skinner, in his speech at Urbana in 1970, basically said, no, Jesus was a revolutionary who came to liberate the people from oppression. And so as a Black American in 1970 who's feeling oppressed by racism, who also claims a Christian identity, it was revolutionary for them.
There's a great book by Ricky Vincent. It's called Party Music, and it's about the Black Panther Party's house band, the Lumpen, of course, short for the Lumpen Proletariat. And I remember reading it, and it blew my mind because I never knew the Black Panther Party had a band, like an official. And basically, the role of this band was to travel around, and before people would speak, very similar like how Tom Skinner had Soul Liberation before Eldridge Cleaver might speak, or before, Elaine Brown might speak, the Lumpen would play and kind of get kids interested in listening and opening up and sort of the same premise that gospel music has in church, kind of getting people ready for the message, right? The music would set the tone for the message. And it kind of just blew my mind, because I always think about the Panthers as being this group that was serious about their business and serious about revolution. And to think that they would make the time for music as part of their mission. I'm wondering if that's something that gets lost in political or social movements today, if we don't think about the ways in which we can incorporate sort of all the elements of life. I think we maybe do you imagine we might sometimes get lost in the serious business of anti-racism and not think about the ways in which that work interacts with culture writ large?
I do. And I think that one of the things that members of the Black Panther Party realized was you have to really meet people where they were. And so, the Black Panther Party was organizing among, all sorts of segments of the Black community, including the lumpen, who were essentially working class, working poor, impoverished sort of Black people. And just like with wealthy or middle income Black people, whoever you're organizing with, you have to meet people where they are. And so people may not stop to listen to a speech, but they may stop to listen to that tune. And there's nothing wrong with that. We shouldn't look down upon that person. We should say, oh, okay, they'll stop for this tune, so let's play that tune and then come with the speech. And it sort of reminds me of one of the more important leaders of the Black Panther Party. So we, of course, there was a recent film that came out that chronicled a little bit about the life of Fred Hampton in Chicago, who, of course, was this incredible leader who was killed, I believe at 19 years old. Another Black Panther Party leader who was killed, I think he was 26 years old, was Bunchy Carter, who was the leader of the LA chapter of the Black Panther Party. And one of the things he was notable for is he would throw and help organize these house parties where, of course, you'd have the music, everybody would be having a good time. And then he'd cut the music, give a quick little speech, right? And then, of course, G up the music. And he was able to recruit people to the party, through that. And again, it's really, truly meeting people where they are. And, I think people, you can really engage and organize people through songs because it's so universal. It's so engaging.
Did you have any groups similar to Soul Liberation or the Lumpen in your youth, or any moments where music helped revolutionize your way of thinking about the world?
Oh, I mean, I did in the late 1990s and early 2000s. I was listening to people like, of course, Nas. I was listening to Gang Starr and Guru. I was listening, of course, to Black Star and Talib. I was listening to. I was listening, of course, to the Locks, who, of course, also would have some social commentary, in some of their songs. I was, of course, listening to Lauryn Hill. All of these rappers and artists and hip hop artists were teaching me. Of course, people like Tupac and Biggie were teaching me about racism as a young person. Mm-hmm. And it wouldn't necessarily be every line of the song, but some of the most memorable lines in some of their songs were, powerful sort of, critiques, whether it's Tupac saying, they got money for war, but they can't feed the poor. And I think this was so important for me. And even it was important for me, let me say, as a writer, I first learned how to write through listening to hip hop. And even as an academic writer, I learned how to write through listening to hip hop. Why? Because, recent studies have shown that hip hop has the most sophisticated vocabulary of any American musical genre.
What do you think hip hop taught you about writing? Obviously how you write is much different than how Jay writes or Most writes or, Talib writes. But so just curious, how did that inform the way you write?
I think for me, it's about how to tell a story, how to use similes, the imagery that you can convey in writing, the contradictions that can be sort of drawn, the economy of words to paint, a sophisticated or complex picture.
So music, it really, to me, I think a lot of times people ask now, like, where's the message gone in music, and it's like, in a lot of ways, there's a lot of people still putting, with music that has like this amazing commentary. But I always think about it in terms of how can music work to bring people into a movement, the way we were sort of talking about at the beginning. But in your case, music literally influenced the way you approach being an anti-racist scholar, if I can call you that. You're scholar.
And I think that's why I even try to, as often as possible, bring in songs, even in my writing. So, I think in How to Be an Antiracist, the chapter on culture, so I brought in some of the songs and music I was listening to when I was, a young person growing up in New York City. Even recently, I think it was last year, I wrote a piece for The Atlantic called, I think this piece was on the other swing voter, in which I sort of talked about how young voters of color who swing between voting Democrat and not voting at all need to be conceived of as swing voters. And that piece was framed around, I think it was, my president is black, my Lambo's blue, but I'll be goddamn, my rims ain't too. And partly because I sort of characterized, or I should frame this sort of piece around Obama's election and how Obama was able to really captivate young people of color. And that song was one of the anthems, of that sort of the latter part of his campaign. And then even recently, I talked about the song, This Is America, in one of my pieces, to really sort of talk through the sort of contradictions. And so to me, I still try to sort of draw from, song and music, particularly hip hop, to talk about these larger societal formations, because in many ways I started seeing them myself through hip hop.
Building off your point there, I'm wondering how you feel hip hop has performed as sort of like the predominant musical outlet for social commentary. Because when you think about it, it's kind of rare that a genre has a hold for as long as hip hop's had on culture. And so for the last 30, 35 years, it's been the predominant way to sort of communicate whatever is happening socially in our country, around the world, and in our communities.
I think that's a stunning observation. I never even thought about it like that. And I think you're absolutely correct. I wonder if part of the reason why hip hop has been able to maintain a hold on the culture is because hip hop is so diverse. In other words, you have explicit, profound social commentary, in certain songs. And then you have other songs with no social commentary, right? It's just to get people dancing or chilling and feeling good about themselves or the world or their girlfriend or boyfriend or hating on. And then you have, of course, songs, in between. And so it really is able to, no matter the type of listener, it's really able to, capture different people. And then I think what's always been at the heart of hip hop has been authenticity. And when a genre is focused or sort of driven by that, it's fundamentally going to have to consistently change, because the culture is going to be consistently changing.
Right.
And so the music thereby, so it isn't static.
Mm-hmm.
And so hip hop is constantly changing. The sound is constantly changing. The rhymes are constantly changing, which then constantly changes to the taste of listeners, which then keeps it relevant.
It's funny. I feel like that diversity of hip hop is what's, in a way, like you say, it's what's allowed it to flourish as long as it has. Like I think you'd be hard pressed to find a genre as diverse in terms of content than hip hop, and in terms of just the sheer amount of ideas that exist in the universe of hip hop, right?
Yeah.
But it's also been, I think, the thing that's made hip hop like easy to criticize.
Well, the irony is that, again, going back to the diversity of hip hop, it has been reflective. I don't know if it's overstating it to say that hip hop has reflected the diversity of thought within sort of among young Black people. Hmm. And so when you think of young Black people in general, there's just so many viewpoints about gender, about sexuality, about class, about race, about the role of an artist, about entertainment, and about money. And so I think that, and so to me, that is the worst and the best part of hip hop. The worst is because, I would rather us leave the baggage of misogyny and sexism and homophobia and materialism and in the sort of American community, like for that not to sort of enter into the music. But then will people actually be attracted to the music, see the music, relate to the music, if they're not sort of hearing what they already believe and see in the world? And I think that's the challenge.
That is a challenge. And it challenges even me, man. Like even a song like My President is Black. Like, obviously Obama's legacy is still developing. It's still to determine, perhaps. And I think it's definitely much more complicated now than maybe 6, 7, 8 years ago. But, going back to 2008, when he was first elected, kind of George W. Bush, and it just felt like the impossible had happened. A song like My President is Black was like, it just made you feel like, I don't know. I don't know if I'll ever feel that way in life again, the way I felt after he was elected. And I'm listening to that song and you're just like, damn, like it's good to be Black, It's like,
yeah.
Damn.
And the irony is he says, my president is Black, my Lambo's blue, and I'll be goddamn if my rims ain't too. So it's not like all political commentary, but that's what made it so cool.
It made it so cool. But that's also, in hindsight, what makes it challenging, because it's like, oh man, there's just the materialism of it, and it's like,
exactly
part of it that 100% appeals to me, and 100% is part of the reason I liked the song. If it was all just my president is Black, and it might feel like a bit overbearing. It helps sort of, bring a commentary to me where I was, but it's funny in hindsight. The song both represents a big moment in a lot of people's lives, my life in particular. But now I'm like, wow, just my Lambo too. I'm like,
And I remember that song in particular. I wrote about this about right after I saw the election results come in at this Black United Forum facility in North Philadelphia, in this Black neighborhood. Everybody was going crazy inside after it was announced. And then we all went outside, and it was just almost like spontaneous parade of cars, everybody honking. And then I remember somebody rolling by thumping that song, right? And so it's just, it's a memorable moment.
earlier at the top, I think we agreed maybe there's less music and culture has sort of, if not even become an afterthought of kind of social and political movements, it's become maybe considered even less than, as if it's not important work. I'm wondering, how can we engage people of all stripes to say, no matter what it is you do, if you make music, if you act, if you write, if you dance, there's a way to take what you do and become a part of this movement. You don't all have to be Dr. Kendi and write, and write a book or there's other ways to contribute. Because I feel like you could really create a big coalition if we could bring more people in.
Well, I agree with you. I don't have an expectation that an artist, someone who is an incredible singer or incredible sort of rapper or producer or beat maker will also be this incredible activist. Like, I don't think we should have the expectation for that. But I do think, a person who through their music, they make a ton of money, I do think they can donate some of that money to racial justice organizations. I do think somebody who gets a ton of influence and a huge platform, because of their songs, that they can elevate racial justice sort of causes or voices who aren't necessarily being heard. I do think that can be done, and so. I privately and publicly, encourage people with who have those, abilities to do so. But I'm not going to basically assess. I don't expect everybody to be an expert on racism. Let me just say. And I think when we push the narrative that everyone's an expert on racism, what that creates is that allows any sort of, let's say, Black person to stand up and say, I'm an expert on racism, and so therefore we shouldn't teach racism in schools. And because I'm Black, I'm an expert. And so therefore you should be listening to me just as much as any expert who actually is trained in this stuff. And then they're able to get a following among many white folks who are racist, who have similar viewpoints. And I'm also very sort of particular about trying to make anyone, particularly artists and entertainers, into experts, because that's just too much. Like, they're already great at one thing. It's hard to be great like at multiple things. I'm not even great at one thing, and they're great at, one thing, and you're asking them to be great at another thing. It's hard.
Well, I mean, you're definitely great at what you do, man. So let's not, short sell you. But that's a great point, man. And well taken. I mean, the idea that because you're Black, you are now an expert on racism. That's how we don't even name people per se, but Candace Owens of the world, or I got to hear from people. I have friends in the middle of the country who say, well, have you heard what Candace Owens is? I don't want to, let's not go there. Let's not talk about it. But that's a point well taken. So I want to encourage people to listen to the official Be Antiracist playlist. We'll link to it in here. I did have one song I was surprised that was not on there. I want to say, Dr. Kendi, before I let you go, being the vegan you are, man, Dead Prez's Be Healthy. How did that not make the list, man? I was waiting for it.
So for me, I don't know how Dead Prez was able to do it, because it's already hard enough to get people to talk about race and racism and be reflective, but then to get people to be reflective on the food they eat, now that's just, and, talk about race, that's just too much. I just wanted to give folks one bite.
Dead Prez is too dope. Dead Prez is too dope. I agree.